want to do the 20-minute, and we'll
I
take
would
a look at that.
love to hear Chris's 20 minutes, because I think he aces it every single time on the authenticity and the likability, but he's in blatant violation of your 30-20-10 rule. And so
We'll see.
I want to.
I have my own, I have my own conventions when it comes to that are based on another cognitive science read on multimedia, that it's very little slide, very few words at any given time, but you can use as many slides as you need to, as long as you don't give people motion sickness by flipping through them too fast. So you can let me know, though, if you think that works. I'm happy to reconsider.
Okay.
I didn't know, just real quick, if we could, Bob, just for a split second, if I could get people's feedback on my initial thoughts on how I would restructure my elevator pitch along the 4 dots on the graph you have. I don't know if we could take 5 minutes where I could kind of put that forward and get everybody's feedback on that.
Yeah.
So if you want to share your
Be happy
screen,
to.
so, in case
You want me to share mine?
yeah, if you don't mind, just because I forget. But I could see that being used almost as a worksheet, where you, like, for me, I want to get the slide and just put a couple of key points at each one,
Yeah, and you could, this gets very easy to remember, because every TV commercial you see that's 30, 60 seconds is doing exactly this.
Yeah.
I'm taking my grandkids to the amusement park, but I can't get to the roller coaster because my back is now hurting, and we have to go home. And everybody, all my grandkids and kids are looking miserable because we have to go home because of my back. But if I just took this prescription, and then you see the next day they're all on the roller coaster with their hands up, that's what the reason they do that. The reason they spend millions of dollars on those ads is because they work. Everything is framed that way. It's always the problem, and they always have the solution, and they try to get as authentic as they can.
Well, I'll just substitute direct air capture for gingivitis, because I think you're right.
That's it. There you go.
But yeah, I mean, I'm not just gonna recreate it simulate it as though I'm doing it, but just in terms of the points, like, I thought, like, the "we have a problem" part is that, I was thinking, I'm working on climate 24/7 because that's the biggest problem, and we're seeing how this is taking shape much faster than we thought. We're in a much more dangerous spot than we thought we'd be. And what we've also found going into the 30-second mark is that not only now we can't afford to just stop emitting, we actually have to take carbon out of the air, which a lot of people, aren't aware of, because we already have too much up there, and we have to do a lot of it. It has to be on the scale of the oil and gas industry right now. We have to be doing that in reverse with carbon removal, and we have to do it by 2050. So that's what I was thinking is the trajectory from, like, climate. Yes, I'm a climate guy. I work on climate, and now, because this other thing is so important, I moved over to that. So that's what I would hope to achieve in that first minute. Does that sound right? Or
yeah, I think that's basically right. I think the problem is trying to get it down to language that's subject predicate, very simple sentences, which is why I like this chart. It's like, we have a problem and it's bigger than you think. We have a problem that we knew was coming, which is that there's too much carbon dioxide going into the atmosphere, and it's making the planet too warm, and that's causing all kinds of climate changes that are coming too fast and too hard. And it's worse than we think. This is like the climatologist's worst scenario.
yeah,
I saw them at Lawrence Livermore when they were developing them 10 years ago. You could hope that we were going to be in the middle of their scenario range. They were like at the worst of their scenario ranges. And it's really bad because the Earth is now warming up so fast ahead of schedule that the tundra is melting and the Earth is starting to
really
breathe out carbon dioxide and methane. So it's worse than they thought. So we're not talking 2050. I mean, I think we're talking 2030.
Yeah,
That
scale by
we're-
2050, but yeah, well on our way by 2030 for sure.
Yeah, and I think without the 2030 number, Chris, it's just people think they got another 30 years. I mean, we don't.
That's a good
We
point.
don't. It's getting intolerable now.
Yeah.
And I think that's the urgency that gets you the volunteers.
Okay, great. So we're finding the problem is we're finding out it's a problem right now,
It's
and then
way
bigger
bigger
than you
than
think.
anybody thought. If you thought
Yeah.
the scientists were wrong, you're correct. They were
Yeah.
they weren't frightened enough.
Yeah, that's perfect. Great. So pivoting into carbon removal, having to remove carbon removal is part of the bigger than you think. And then with the solutions part, I want to say, but, kind of two things there, but, three things really, but that fortunately, like it's amazing how many options are emerging in carbon removal that are so diverse and different from each other and moving so fast. And what I was hoping to maybe put in there is, as a person who came from renewable energy and saw that move so fast, this is like nothing by comparison. You know what I mean? That it's amazing the mobilization that is happening, right?
Yeah.
And that the other beat to that, which links it to OpenAir and Carbon Crowd, is, but what we also have is we have an opportunity for involving so many different types of people in a way that we formerly couldn't because of the internet, because of our connectivity. So we have these solutions that can be accelerated and brought to scale because we can bring so many people into the space to make a meaningful contribution. So that was kind of what I wanted to kind of the solutions are both the technical solutions, but the availability of people and all that they bring to it have never been at a higher level. Like, so if I could land both of those two pieces, in that 30 seconds, I don't know if that's too big of a bite, but I think they're both.
I think you've got it right. I think it's just taking it down to very powerful words. Do you know how many different sciences offer solutions now?
Oh my God. It's geology, biology, soil science, all forms of engineering, marine sciences. Yeah, there's so many.
And of course, chemistry underpins all of it.
Chemistry, yeah.
But there are thousands of ways to take carbon dioxide out of the air and put it back in the ground.
Yeah, and it not only touches on different sciences, it touches on different existing sectors, which is so important. We're not creating this in a vacuum, but like some of the things that were even problematic in the past can be part of the solution, whether you're talking about mining or, geological storage. Like we have a platform that we can integrate with in the existing economy to make these things scale rather than create something from scratch.
So another way you can effectively do that is to pick out one and just say, we have hundreds of solutions. There are people working on hundreds of different ways to take carbon dioxide out of the air and put it back on the ground. One is, and do a quick description of it, and it will take X amount out. Now multiply that times 100 or 1,000. That's how much work is going on out there right now.
Yeah.
So it's taking one and exploding it with a multiple, sometimes in a faster way, a more memorable way. Because if I could see even one of those ways, and I've been watching the videos I love them. I mean, I love the science. I don't want to get into the detail or need to get into the detail of how it works, but if somebody tells me we're taking X pounds of carbon out of using putting crushed rock on farms, I love it. And you tell me there's hundreds of different ways to do it and people are trying it and we need to get them more money. I think that's the 30 seconds.
Yeah. Okay.
I'm really glad you mentioned the farm thing, because I was actually going to pop in to mention that the possibility of weaving in co-benefits, right? So if you say taking ground up basalt and putting it into your farm, yeah, there's a huge benefit in terms of climate restoration and pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. Oh, and guess what? You have higher crop yield
Yeah.
and lower costs. You know,
I think in the 20-minute version for sure.
yeah, fair. Okay. Yeah,
And anybody that I've told about that since I saw it, which is a lot of people, I've said exactly that.
Yeah. Great.
But I do it that way, Carl. I just say, look, I watched this thing for 20 minutes. It's amazing. The impact is huge. It needs a lot of money to be grown to scale. And it's only one of hundreds of ways you could do this. And we need an army of people out there doing it. Here's the OpenAir site.
Yeah.
That's my
Yeah.
30 seconds.
That's
Well,
what Carl
what
always
example-
says. He tells
what
people,
example?
just go look. Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
But what example would you have taken, Chris? And I don't like to take DAC because people say, well, then where do you put the carbon? And
Yeah.
so I'm more partial to the weathering and biochar, and of course, the beloved cement. But
Yeah.
what would you have taken? What do you use, Chris?
And here's the thing, I guess, where it does matter, in spite of, you know, what you said, Bob, it might, who you're talking to might even dictate that to you. And luckily I have some of those things in my pocket, you know, where I can certainly talk about, I do think that the agricultural stuff, because it links it to something that's typically thought of as a problem, as an emitter. It's located in places that are often quite removed from the climate discourse or already kind of settled on it. So you're kind of giving here's a heroic role for these, you know, for farmers to have. And that it also creates opportunity because the co-benefits are very rich when we talk about agricultural working lands ones. So I'm with you on that one. There's also benefit to also just trying to wow people with some of the highest magnitude options we have, like direct air capture and ocean alkalinity enhancement. Those are the most bright steel, sort of like, wow, you know, and you know, and they give people hope because there's an enormous amount of carbon that can be taken out. So I would probably have a couple of three different stock ones maybe that I would apply as my example based on who I'm talking to.
I was going to say that, Chris, for a 20-minute talk, I would go with 3.
Yeah, there's a magic of,
and then use a multiplier.
yeah. 3 is always the pattern that people see, that you can tell them there's a lot here if you just have that minimum of 3, you know?
Right.
But that's good. And then for the value is, I mean, as these guys know, I always like to, if we start with sort of, this is a huge problem, this deserves urgency. I truly, not just because I think it's good messaging, but this is the way I think about it, is that to really leave with, like, you know, this idea that imagine if we do solve this, like what a level up for humanity that is, you know what I mean? That the implications of that are extraordinary, and that's why we're vigilant, but we're really optimistic, you know what I mean? But the key to it is having as many people come into OpenAir as possible, and so that's kind of an open invite. That type of a thing, I think I'm thinking.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's a great way to go.
All right, I'm gonna practice this bad boy. Not right now. I gotta absorb it a little bit. But that's good. This is super, super helpful. Great. So happy to give the 20-minute one now, if that would be helpful, and maybe tell you a little bit, unless you think that's breaking the rules, but why I'm bringing this presentation to you, because it's an important one that I've wanted to make for 5 years.
Go ahead and tell me.
So, you know, OpenAir is based on some somewhat unconventional assumptions, you know, and it's built in a way that is not familiar within the climate and more broadly the sort of nonprofit activist space. And the fact that it has no formal organization and no one gets paid and it's entirely distributed is different, right? And I fell in love with that idea well over a decade ago with grad school, and then started implementing some of it when I was still in solar, both in Afghanistan and India and New York, you know, in very different contexts. And I think it's important to be able to express in a concise and compelling way what that formula is and why we believe it, and then linking it to a specific project area that shows people this is it in action and we want you to join. So it's kind of like the concepts and inspirations for the whole, you know, notion of going down this road rather than creating a brick and mortar nonprofit and then showing it in action. That's kind of what I'm trying to do with this.
Yeah, and in fact, the best organizational and psychological discussions I've seen on community and organizations, period, is what you're doing is the model that would work. That you've got a self-organizing ecosystem around an attractor. So the founders are the attractors. It's a values attraction, and in a world that changes as fast as this one, there is no point in forming a bureaucracy. The bureaucracy itself will destroy what you're doing, what you're trying to do. So staying away from the old model is exactly right.
Bingo. That's exactly what I'm trying to communicate in it. So I'll go ahead and share my screen here. It's not done, obviously, nor is it supposed to be. And I also do envision this as this 20-minute, like the 90-second, like parsing it out. Like Peter was telling me yesterday, it's like, well, maybe some of these things you're trying to go in depth in, these should be these standalone pieces, and they have a different sort of media to get the word out. But anyway, I will just get into it here. All right. So Carbon Crowd is a tool or an extension of OpenAir, and I explained that how that works. Let me just go into present mode here. All right, great. All right, so what I want to do right now is really land by talking about a really exciting new mission that OpenAir has just launched called Carbon Crowd. But in order for that to make sense to everybody, I think I have to tell you a little bit about the journey that OpenAir has taken that has led us to Carbon Crowd, and the different ingredients intellectually and inspirationally that we've collected over a period of many of years to get us here. So I want to kind of pop the hood a little bit on what is the formula that makes OpenAir run, and how that's led to Carbon Crowd. And so one quote that we really love that you'll find on our website for Carbon Crowd that is really at the essence of what OpenAir is that this one here from a biologist, that large group of small connected things can achieve almost anything if connected in the right way. And if you need to know anything about the thesis of OpenAir, I would say that is it. But obviously, we're not operating with ants as much as they're an inspiration for what we do. What OpenAir aims to do is to actually do this with people and realize that there are so many people out there with different ideas, experience, knowledge, motivations, energy level, and connections that are just latent right now. And if we can involve the maximum number of people, then we'll be able to solve problems in new ways that we never have before, including with carbon removal. And that is what the focus of OpenAir is. We are a climate-focused advocacy and doer organization, but we've taken on this particular essential area of carbon removal is our area of activity that we're trying to influence. And carbon removal is new to the climate conversation, but a really essential one that has to be well known fast. And we have to scale carbon removal, taking carbon out of the air very, very rapidly and get to a large scale in the next 10, 20, 30 years. And that's what we're committed to. And the key pieces that really have to happen here is this has to happen fast. We have to have progress really fast. We have to scale fast, faster than anything we've ever scaled in human history. And the underlying common denominator for this is to do this unprecedented thing requires an enormous amount of creativity. The old sort of playbooks, even for successful industries, are just not sufficient. We need to be thinking in truly new ways. So OpenAir really looks at this holy trinity here, is the things that we're sort of monitoring our own activities and success with, particularly creativity. And now, how will we get there? What is the way in which we're going to reach where we need to go with carbon removal? And conventionally, this means roles for very different types of actors or organizations. Certainly firms, both startups and incumbents in the private sector, they play a huge role in building and delivering these solutions. It's not likely that there'll be any market for those solutions unless government on every level, from national, multinational, subnational, and municipal, create policies that create a conducive environment for carbon removal, and help catalyze demand for it. We need a lot of brain power, and some of that is vested in government and firms, but research institutions at universities and other public universities or quasi-private universities play an enormous role in generating our knowledge. And boy, do we have to generate a lot of knowledge in order for this to happen. And then, of course, there's the critically important role of the civil society organizations, nonprofits, advocacy organizations, think tank, that keep the public eye and the world's eye focused on this need, explaining it and making sure that we're moving fast enough. Now, because this is such a unique and novel problem in terms of the size and scale and just the novelty of it, the question is this combination of organizations, regardless of how robust and how energized and well supported, is that enough to get us to where we need to, when we need to, in the form that we want to get there to? And we don't think it necessarily is. And organizations, again, there's a very impressive ecosystem developing around carbon removal that OpenAir is very much enmeshed in. But organizations of any kind, whether they're small startups or large government bureaucracies, have certain characteristics that can be limiting factors in getting us to move creatively, fast, and at scale. They're hierarchical. There's often, a chain of command in which certain people have decisions and they have to filter and make decisions where other people follow. And they're inherently constrained in terms of the resources that will support them for their infrastructure, for their staff, and whatever staff that they have, they can't see everything. So they have constraints in their own line of vision on what's happening in the world. And by definition, they have to have borders around them, whether it's virtual or it's a real building, they're closed. Not everybody can be part of an organization. And sometimes organizations, because they're closed and they fight for status and for resources, they have to be somewhat competitive and they have to not let certain people in. And so these characteristics of organizations, which vary differently by organization, are limiting factors. And when you look at it in practice, organizations exist to solve problems and offer solutions, regardless of what category they fit into. And they have to hire particular people and make certain investments in order to be able to do that, which will always be inherently limited or constrained, as I just mentioned. And as I said, they have to be closed. So they have to be separated from the outside world. Even if they're oriented towards collaborations and partnerships, there's limitations to that within an organizational context. And so this is a quote that we really love from a tech thinker and doer, is that all of us are smarter than any of us. And so regardless of how many smart people you have in your room that you've invested in, there's always the world outside that is smarter, way smarter. And the solutions are out there. And when you're within an organization, you don't necessarily have the mandate, resources, or line of vision to make connection and make use of those solutions. So we need a construct that maximally draws on and leverages the public at large to get that knowledge and those solutions. And so that's why OpenAir, rather than founding itself as an organization, we actually use the network as our frame of reference for what we are and what we want to become. And so a little bit on networks and how they are different from organizations. There's some key things. By contrast, these are typically non-hierarchical associations of people being able to interact freely without a boss or a manager telling them what they should or should not be doing. They're highly decentralized. They need to be designed in a way where people, wherever they are, wherever their laptop is, they can enter and connect with other people rather than being centralized. Everything is constrained, but when it comes to actually adding people and involvement, if you design it right, a network can actually be highly unconstrained. They can actually involve and include lots of different people and resources without a cost. And then the key to that is being open, is that there has to be a low barrier to entry. If people are interested in carbon removal and they come in and they understand what the community is like, let's not put barriers up for them being able to speak, communicate, and contribute. And so again, just to put these a little bit more of a fine point on it, the decentralized part, if you have a truly open network, that means that people who otherwise might not have ever encountered each other, that might actually be rhyming in terms of their ideas, or one has a missing piece to fit into another person's idea, they can find each other and connect and come up with novel ideas, which is not something even the most creative or innovation-oriented organization can necessarily do because of the constraints that I already mentioned. And again, unconstrained, as I said, everything is constrained, but if you're able to truly create an inviting low barrier atmosphere like this, as we already see within OpenAir, people from all over the world would show up, and a lot of people that would never be a mile from an interview at a tech company or a government position. Their resumes or their credentials might not recommend that, but boy, do they have something in their brain when combined with somebody else's brain can create something truly new. And that is what we're looking for in OpenAir. And this is a very famous, going back to the early days of open source and software that Eric Williams put, given enough eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. So bugs being problems. And we believe that. It's really about getting eyeballs and brains plugged into a community to solve problems and identify solutions. And one thing to point out about organizations as well, and when it relates, this is my experience working mostly for nonprofits, is that there's a relationship with orgs between speed and creativity. And often, this is not always the case, but when an organization grows and becomes more complex, its speed and creativity can go down because of bureaucracy and because of the chain of command. When networks are well structured, it's actually the opposite. You'll have, as a network, when it grows, it can actually become faster and more creative because you have more dynamics that are interacting with each other and more emergence. So that's one of the things that I think is a secret element of networking, how it plugs into this massive problem. Now, how do you do that? You don't just throw a bunch of people together on a Slack. There has to be some mechanics and some sort of rules or parameters. And two that we draw from that have their origins in software, but are now well penetrated into different domains, are two linked structures called peer production and open source. And so peer production is a term that for about 20 years has been around. And what it describes is models of making things in which a large numbers of people, usually the internet is the great enabler of this, are able to freely and cooperatively find each other and work together. So I've already described that. An implication of that is that it doesn't typically have that really rigid hierarchy that any organization has in order to maintain its own existence. And critically, which I haven't mentioned yet, is that often networks like this that are able to scale, they can't be based on wages or exchange like markets normally. People contribute for the love of contributing. And so there's not an actual financial contribution for contributors. And OpenAir is very much built on this model where nobody is permanent staff and nobody is paid staff. One of the leading theorists of peer production is the scholar Yochai Benkler, who's at Harvard Law School. And what he adds another element to that is explaining, well, why do they contribute to something where there's no financial reward to it? What is the reason why you get people to converge around a common cause? And the thing that he really zeroes in is the idea of distinguishing between extrinsic and intrinsic forms of motivation. And extrinsic motivation can have many different things, but an easy one to illustrate it is getting paid for your work or getting profit from an investment or equity stake in something. You're doing the thing. You might love your job, but ultimately you're doing it because it's something that supports your livelihood or your other goals. It's something outside that you get from doing the work. Where intrinsic is something where there's something about the actual activity itself and what it does that you're animated by because of your values, your priorities, your social needs. You intrinsically want to come and do this thing. And amateur, I believe the French word actually means for the love of doing something, and so we're very much an amateur network, and we use that word as a high compliment. And then so when you have what does intrinsic motivation consist of? It could be many different things, and any network should be able to accommodate many different forms of motivations. But it might be something that gives somebody a sense of purpose. They're doing it because they feel it's an important thing to do. They could do it because it's a lot of fun. They could do it because by performing within this network and being seen performing, they gain status and reputation. They feel good about what they've done because they realize other people value it. Networks like this form senses of communities virtually, places some of my best friends, in fact, all of my best friends. My only community is OpenAir. As it's an important place for me to spend time because it fulfills my community needs. And then a lot of things with this is that some people might say, God, the market just isn't delivering this thing that I want. This is somewhat extrinsically motivated. I think we could build our own. So sometimes networks can actually produce new directions for products and solutions that the market itself isn't incentivized to deliver. And so the crowding out effect is what is sort of an interesting paradox that Benkler talks about when you try to mix extrinsic and intrinsic motivations. You might have a great network going on where people are showing up for the love of the thing. They have community, they're having fun, it's delivering purpose. But when you start to introduce extrinsic motivations into a network like this, it actually causes people to quit or to ask, why am I not getting paid? And why is this person getting paid? And you can actually wind up by, oops, I just did that wrong, by actually reducing participation. Sorry, hit pause for 1 second. I click back on that. Right. All right, here I am. Almost. Brains. All right, here we are. And all right. So that's the crowding out effect. The other part that goes with peer production that's right at the heart of OpenAir is the idea of open source. And open source is boiled down is just something that people can modify that's put out in the public domain, and they can share freely with each other because they're permitted to. The maker of that thing makes it freely accessible to everybody else, how it's built, and then makes it non-proprietary. So anybody can use it and build their own thing out of it. And open source is the key oxygen in the room that it actually allows people to act on things because they can put their hands on it and they can put their brains on it. And open source comes from software, and it's actually a formal legal category where you create a type of a license. The GNU license is one, but there are many where you actually slap that on your product or the thing that you're making that permits other people to use it. And so everything that we do in OpenAir is open source, even if it doesn't require a license. And some examples for this, things like free and open source software, where it all started. Many people don't know how much of the software that runs our lives was developed by communities of people contributing freely to open source software. Linux and Apache and many different things that make our digital world work are all open source. Wikipedia is within the open source family. These are people contributing for the love of knowledge and want other people to have it. And it does something that no other encyclopedia under an organizational model could possibly do. There's no way it could be that expansive within a normal organizational framework. We see this with funding. So many things now that are created and new and get funding are done through crowdfunding with Kickstarter, but now there are dozens of different platforms for that we're also starting to use at OpenAir to raise our own money. And then other examples that are very relevant to OpenAir are open source hardware. What's been done with software, now increasingly there's people building gadgets and gizmos, and they're putting the designs up on different public formats with public licenses so that other people can hack and build them. And then what we call citizen science, which is often related to mass participation of citizens, testing and making observations, can fill certain gaps in the scientific record that really couldn't be done by small teams in a laboratory. So this is an area that is already very, very productive and continues to expand. And that is where OpenAir is cut from that cloth. But in order to do open source and peer production really well, taking a quote from the granddaddy of it all, Linus Torvalds, you have to get a lot of people involved, because if you don't, all that magic between the dynamics between people doesn't kick in. So you can't do it with few people. And the types of open source projects that tend to thrive and be sustained are the ones that create highly intrinsically motivated, attractive environments that can do those types of things. And that's what OpenAir really tries to do. Can we have all of these elements that are there where people get satisfaction? But we also think that the subject that we're working within, broadly speaking, climate change, lends itself to this. There's so many potential eyeballs that are already looking at this and that derive a sense of purpose from working on it and participating in communities, that we feel like there's a strong latent public that could actually be drawn on for this. And carbon removal in particular is really ripe for this because it's so new. There's so many facets to it that it can involve many, many different types of people based on their interests. So that is our theory of the case at OpenAir, is we think that we're sitting on a domain that is ripe for this form of open source peer production. Now, to conclude, one other important concept here is the idea of diversity and creativity. And diversity is talked about a lot now as an end in and of itself, as it should be. But one important thing that often gets left out when we think about diversity is that there's so much evidence for this in so many different domains, is the more diverse, the more different types of people, background, skills, knowledge, life experience that you have interacting with each other, the faster you're going to get to novel solutions. This has been demonstrated again and again. So to that point, it's not just about having a lot of brains, it's about having a lot of different types of brains and a lot of different types of experiences and people who can come in and mix it up. And it's when you have the interactions between people who might not normally engage with each other within the context of a network, that you can get those eureka moments, those truly novel, unsiloed moments. And that's what we are on the hunt for in OpenAir and are hopefully built to do. So now to link this to what is this in terms of how we're actually activating this. And OpenAir has been a community that's been steadily growing for the last 5 years. We are a community of people that hang out on a Discord and on a lot of Zoom calls, talking and planning. And that's where a lot of our ideas emerge from our members. What we've realized is we need a more focused platform that puts some parameters around evolving the things that we're trying to make, putting them on a timetable and ensuring that we can attract a lot of eyeballs. And that's what Carbon Crowd has been built, is to be that platform as an extension of the OpenAir community. And how it works is that first, some things happen within OpenAir that already happen naturally. This might be an idea, someone comes along and says, I have an idea for a mini biochar pyrolyzer. That's an actual idea that Kate is working on in Puerto Rico. And he talks to a couple of other people, say, I like that idea. Let's keep talking about it on the Discord. And then if there's true interest there, it advances to, all right, what are we going to do? And so that the thing that we're actually going to build, these could be devices or things, but it can also be citizen science, testing and data. It could be legislation and policy, and it could be funding things. So it could be many different things. But once it's gotten to an idea that a certain critical mass of people are interested in, it's about, all right, let's test it out. Let's make that thing happen. And to use the language of software open source, a kernel, a basic thing that can be built and demonstrated in the world. And by that time, hopefully you've attracted a few other people to come in and help you out with that. And then you're going to build it. And it's at this stage, once it's built, is that we want to publish and share it. So we're going to make it open source so the world can see it and try to spread it, and also document how other people can do the exact same thing. So these two phases happen within OpenAir already, and we're getting better and better at being more productive. Where Carbon Crowd comes into is, I went backwards there, is this idea of, okay, now let's have many people build it. And let's make sure we make our documentation so it reduces the limitations. And can we use Carbon Crowd as a way to keep growing a community that is focused and is invested in this particular idea, and it can help us evolve it. And so that's what Carbon Crowd does. When you come to Carbon Crowd, you post your project on the platform. And then what we do is we have every 2 months, another version of it is going to be built, at least one of them in some other part of the world, that will have a theme to it saying, okay, we built it. Now we want to improve it in this area. Who's got the idea? And then we build it, and we keep sharing as we go and try to build more and more eyeballs and recruit for the problems and questions that we have. And so it's about just making sharper lines around the delivery of impact for OpenAir by creating that and evolving it through a kind of a relay where we build every 2 months a new thing. And so we've already started this right now as we speak. Later on today, we have a webinar that we're reporting our progress. The very first one is an open source DAC project that's being built by a group of amazing volunteers in Philadelphia, all volunteers, most engineers by background. And this has already made amazing progress, and we're building a community around it. And so that's as far as I got. So I'll stop right there. And I'm sure I went way too deep and went way too long, but that's what I got.
No, that's good. That's good. Well, it's good to see what you're up to. So who's the audience for it?
Well, I think that's a good question. I mean, I think that the audience is, what I want to have happen through this is that people say, I'm part of that audience, and I didn't know I was part of that audience.
Yeah.
That there's a way for me to come in. This is the place for me to come in and apply myself, and so it's kind of for a general audience, I would say.
So I think there's a more effective way to present that. So let me start. I love your last several slides. Once you get OpenAir's role and then Carbon Crowd role, yeah, that slide makes perfect sense to me, and it's very practical. And then the next few slides are also make a lot of sense and are practical. Up until that point, you're making a case for networked organization structure being stronger than bureaucratic hierarchical. And I believe all that's true. so I don't differ with that at all. I mean, I like the idea. I think a better way to present it is with the idea that I would start with, we have a problem, and the problem is our hierarchical structures and the way capitalism is working in the world is not moving fast enough to respond to the climate crisis, period. It just isn't. The problem is coming faster than it could ever respond. And there are lots of parts of it that are doing a good job, but particularly around alternative energies. But when you look at the climate accord, we're just not going to make those goals without taking carbon out of the atmosphere. And there are a lot of small projects trying to do that right now that are really exciting, but we're not making the progress there that we absolutely have to. We think maybe from an organizational point of view, the only way you can respond quickly enough to the crisis potentially is to mimic the way an ecosystem works, which is what you're doing. You're just mimicking a forest, right?
I like it.
And if I could, so the punchline is, I'm trying to use ecology to rescue our ecology.
I love it.
And OpenAir is the value system that in ecology and with a couple of little rules, that is how an ecosystem is held together. We are the gravity of the ecosystem that is going to save the ecosystem.
So good. I like it.
And
It's
then
really
and then the beginning of your 20 minutes is really why the existing hierarchical talent that's out there is hamstrung trying to deal with a problem this complex and this urgent. And the only way we're going to do it is by mimicking an ecological system. And an ecological system is not held together by paying anybody or by carving up roles. You have a few simple rules and values that attract people, and that's it.
And everything emerges from that, from those basic grammar.
And solutions will be emergent properties.
Yeah. I love what you said too, because Bob, it has a twofer, which all these guys on the call will know, is that we're all committed environmentalists and climate people and share many of the things, but there's the perception of CDR as this Frankenstein monster that's the opposite of an ecosystem mode. So to use a metaphor that is explicitly saying that we're basing this on an ecosystemic model, kind of checks a box there if we do it right, I think. So it's a good.
And the graphic possibilities are wonderful. I mean, I thought your ants opening is exactly right.
Don't get me started about ants. These guys know about.
No, I'm right there with you on the ants.
So Chris, I didn't know anything about this. So I don't know what that means, but I have my little corner of the OpenAir collective that I just love. But something needs to change for me or be directed so that I get exposure to other things like this. I mean, there may be, and this community right here is good for me and is doing what I need. But I needed to know about that carbon crowd stuff.
Yeah,
so I love those last. I would save the ants slide or film, and I would save the last 4 or 5 slides, and in the middle I would redo it a lot.
Peter kind of brought this up yesterday, where, as I said, is he thought it was a bit overkill on the sort of the foundational concepts, and that maybe those be taken out as smaller little segments and be disciplined with keeping those in a 90-second thing. Like these are the ingredients of OpenAir intellectually,
Yeah, I think the academic research that backs up where you're headed could be useful if someone demanded it.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't present it to them.
Okay.
I mean, I like to know that what I'm saying has got some academic foundation. And so I've looked at all that stuff that you showed, because I've been espousing network organization design forever. And Peter Robertson in the Netherlands is the most brilliant scientist I know on that topic. And he's just finished a draft of his book, his next book, which is beyond anything I've ever seen. But he says exactly what you're saying. And he has the rationale for doing what you're doing with the organization design.
He's a scientist, Peter Robinson?
Peter Robertson
Oh, Robertson. Okay.
is wrote a book called Always Change a Winning Team. And I can put you in touch, but I have one of the few copies of his draft where he's espousing that integrity can be measured mathematically. But the reason he wants to be able to do that is because it's integrity that holds together ecosystems. So it's a brilliant doctoral thesis that he's about to release.
Yeah, I'd love to. Well, I can't wait for it to come out.
You would go crazy on that, but I would never present that to a crowd. I mean, it's just too esoteric.
So one thought. Sorry, Bob.
No, right ahead.
I was just thinking, in the spirit of trying to get a lot of the middle bits out, but the one, as a software guy, to me, all the open source stuff, totally resonated. The one example that I think almost the whole world knows about is Wikipedia. And so if you just maybe use that as your kind of foundational example of, there used to be this thing called the Encyclopedia Britannica. Does anybody remember that? And just say, that was a hierarchical by a closed company, et cetera. Now we have Wikipedia. That might be sufficient to kind of hook people to say, oh yeah, I personally benefit from that, and maybe I've even contributed to it, and I get that
open
model.
source, Wikipedia, a lot of the AI stuff that's around is all basically going in the same direction. I think you're absolutely right. I love the organization model. I don't know that you have to justify it very much, but for environmentalists to go with an environmental structure makes perfect sense to me.
Yeah. And I like the idea, you're right, Carl, is just use Wikipedia as the paradigmatic example. And then maybe right after that, just put 5 other logos of different things and say, and it's also here, but not giving it the same treatment. You know what I mean?
Right.
Like, so showing that it's a more pervasive model, but really focusing 80% on one that everybody knows about.
Actually.
And I think you have to say none of that's perfect. I mean, there are a lot of Wikipedia information that's imperfect. But it's imperfection that we can live with, because that's the only way we're going to get enough information fast enough for enough people. So then you don't get an argument whether Wikipedia is any good or not.
Definitely.
Of course, it's not perfect, but don't let perfection stand in the way of great. We got to make a great thing happen.
That can only be learned. You know what I mean? That's the thing. That's such a foundational thing to me, is that you have to be just good enough. And open source is very much based on that. It's like, show us your crappy thing, because you got to get it out there in order for it to get better, Yeah. Or a lot of activists don't, they're waiting for perfect from base one.
Yeah, and not to beat the ecosystem thing with too hard, but that's the way nature works also.
Exactly.
In terms of evolution and, mistakes and all that stuff.
Our human needs suck. We could design one, in a second that's better, but it was good enough for us to pass on genes, So
yeah, well, Peter Robertson says the first people that invented the first farm were the beginning of the end. Yeah, because you were able to live off of the beyond the ecosystem, and you just disrupted it, and it's what keeps you alive. So we've got one hell of a lot of work to do to make the air breathable. So thank you for what you're doing. I really appreciate it. And